Okay, well, I am very excited about this panel because when I have had conversations with both panelists here today, they've always left me intrigued and curious and wanting more. Also, my digital literacy is as high as this empty cup of water. So having these two experts with us is really wonderful because they are experts about these issues. Our panel is called The New Frontiers of Digital Era Philanthropy, What We Need to Know. And our two panelists are Lucy Benholtz and Phil Chow. So Lucy is a senior research scholar at Stanford University Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society and director of the Digital Civil Society Lab. She has been a visiting scholar at the Daeville and Lucille Packard Foundation and a fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center in Italy, the Hybrid Reality Institute, and the New America Foundation. She is the author of numerous articles and books that you can read about in her program bio. I won't cite them all. Lucy, welcome.
Thank you.
So Phil and I, talking about the Bellagio Center, met at Bellagio last year. Phil is a technology entrepreneur working at the intersection of benevolent artificial intelligence, youth development, and philanthropy. He's the co-founder and CEO of Humanitas AI, and Philip and his team at Humanitas seek to solve the systemic inequalities endured by the world's 99%. Just a simple mission. You can read more about him in his bio. It would take a long time to list everything here, but Phil, welcome.
Thank you.
So in this conversation, I want us to explore some important topics, and I predict you might have different opinions about them, which is wonderful, and why we got you on this stage together. We'll also have a chance of hearing more from Lucy's research later today, and Phil will also do a lightning talk for us later. So my question one is a very unnuanced question, which is about ethics and morals. And I'm just going to put it out there, and I hope that some of you, are going to identify with it. Is this new era of digital philanthropy good or bad?
Okay, I guess I'll go first.
Go ahead.
So Confucius is saying, you know what you know what you don't know, and you don't know what you don't know. And I think right now we're kind of hovering between 2 and 3. And one of the challenges that we have on a broader basis, not just philanthropy, but in the nonprofit sector, is that we really don't know how to define things in terms of social impact. What do we actually mean by that? Or even when we try to squeeze out financial transparency with grassroots organizations, it's very messy compared to what we see in publicly listed companies and also from government ministerial departments. So I would say that we're working with imperfect information. And because of that, even if we have the best intentions, we can make very dramatic mistakes and not really understand or even know about it till weeks and months later when our consultants, give us, our latest reporting on what have happened with our latest grant a couple months ago. So I think, there's a lot of gap in terms of timing, in terms of impact that I need to go with. So long story short, I think in terms of whether it's good or bad, I want to believe it's net good, but I think we need to be a lot more aggressive and a lot smarter to achieving that goal.
I know I'm supposed to disagree with Phil, but and I do on plenty of things. We'll get there.
Yep.
I think we know a lot more than we think we know. I think for everyone in this room who may not have ever written a line of software code, raise your hand if you have written a line of software code. Okay, that's actually not bad. But for those folks, and even for those of us who have not, we have adapted a stance of learned helplessness. And it's time to get over it. It's a deliberate stance. It's a framing that's been put before us deliberately to make us think we can't understand digital. You know a lot more than you think. And I'm going to prove it to you in 20 minutes. So we know a lot about what matters. We know a lot about what we care about. We know a lot about what we value. And we know a lot about how we want the world to look. And in an age in which digital tools have been made to seem like magic, we act as if we actually believe and act as if we don't. And that's not helping us. So once we all recognize that we still have the agency and power that we need to make the change we care about and value the things we continue to value collectively, I think we will begin to shift this power dynamic about not just ourselves and digital, but just, Emily, you were perfect intro without even realizing it, that personal sense of helplessness and the collective sense and the degree sort of collectively in our countries of origin and our countries of residence that we've ceded an awful lot of power to a set of actors that are not actually seeking to make the world necessarily a better place or to act on the values that we care about. They're commercial industries that are seeking to make profit. Many of them do, in fact, also give back, but that's not their primary motivation. Their primary reason for existence is neither running a government nor acting in the independent sector. They're commercial enterprises, and that's what they're really good at. And we have ceded far too much authority to that financialization motivation, that profit-making motivation, and the other two sectors of democracies, civil society and the government, are out of balance. And it's just a matter of taking back that power and rebalancing that arrangement.
And I think what's interesting to me in this conversation, and Helen talked about, it's about people. Mm-hmm. And I gave a few elements in the introduction about how actually maybe some of these tools are really supporting a more equal agenda, mm-hmm. right, at a certain level. But from where I'm standing, I'm also seeing those who are being left behind, mm-hmm. right? And those who were with us last year, we talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is the tagline, leave no one behind. And so I'd like to hear from both of you, what are we doing about that? And is there data that what are the elements that we don't yet understand? I think it is fair to say that there's a huge, gender digital gap on top of being just a digital gap. Mm-hmm. So talk about that for us a little bit.
Go first, yeah. So what we've experienced collectively across the world in the last decade or so has been a reshifting of those divides. Yes, there are lots of ways in which, particularly in an age of pervasive digital technology, the costs of being able to speak and being able to share your opinion are significantly lower. That doesn't mean you're going to be heard, and it doesn't mean it's enough just to be able to speak. So again, it goes back to this kind of structural set of power relationships. They're different than they were in the analog age, but they still exist. And they will continue to exist until we, as civil society actors and citizens in democracies, take them on directly. They're not going to, any of the 400 years that Hélène showed us, doesn't of its own accord shift human power dynamics. Humans shift human power dynamics. They can use the tools we have to do that, but it requires a really direct attendance to do that, not just simply letting those who create them or get to those tools first set the norms.
I think right now, between US and China, in terms of the AI R&D race, I like to call our approach right now 1.0, in the sense that it's a very Cadillac, expensive approach to doing R&D development for the sake of R&D development. We're not actually building algorithms to solve problems. We're building algorithms and see which algorithm is faster than the previous algorithm. Just an example, there's a nonprofit that Elon Musk funds. It's called OpenAI. Their budget, I think, is about...
It's no longer a nonprofit.
Yep, it's not for profit.
Sorry, in case I stole your thunder, I just wanted to point that out.
And I actually don't like the fact that they've transitioned to this new role. But their budget last year is about $40 million with a staff of 23 engineers. So it's pretty expensive to do the kind of work and approach that they have. And I would say that we need to reverse engineer. We need to think about what is a problem in society that we need and what are the things we need to do to solve that problem. But this also brings together another question that a lot of my friends and classmates that are very technical, very smart engineers, they haven't left their mom's basement. Like, you can't just import someone like that, put them in Turkey at a humanitarian summit, and be like, you have a day and a half to save the world. What are you going to build? you just don't have that domain expertise and context. I mean, even if we look at where smartphones are right now, we're pricing out people, for one, and two, a lot of the algorithms that are the most state-of-the-art, the most advanced, are only useful for the latest phones.
Right.
So it means that in the US of A, we're literally like shrinking the access of people in the coastal cities that can access to these things. Yes, that can make our lives a lot more convenient, but only if you have 5G internet, only if you have $1,000 phone, only if you're in a place where it's providing services. Uber Eats does not deliver to all 50 plus states. Some examples. Yeah.
So you mentioned the nonprofit turned for-profit, and my third question is actually about that. So with the rise of technology-driven philanthropic tools, we're also seeing the rise of for-profit actors that now play a role in the giving structures and models that are out there. And we know it's not a perfect relationship. We've explored it many times here, but that comes with its own set of new challenges and problems, right? How are we adapting to the rise of these nonprofit actors? Are they absolutely necessary? And yeah, what does it look like?
I think the language is holding us back. We need mission-driven organizations. We need efforts and enterprises and collective action that's geared toward achieving things that either the market will not support or governments will not provide. And it's usually a combination of those two. The nonprofit language I actually think is gonna disappear, but the idea of purpose-specific action should never go away. Again, the focus on financialization and the recognition that, in fact, there are markets to be served is why you'll see commercial enterprises entering into this space. And yes, it is possible to blend revenue generation and social purpose. But we've seen now for decades and in cultures across the world that when those enterprises that are revenue generating, revenue sustainable and profit and purpose driven reach a certain point, the larger financial structures in which they operate are going to require them to lean more heavily on the profit making. So something's got to stay in a place that allows us as people to come together and pursue those purposes that are not going to be sustainable in that way, and that our governments, either by will of the majority, or in the case of my country, will of the minority, are not going to pursue.
I think there are two macro factors that, as a for-profit, that we cannot...
Say it louder. Say it louder.
For-profit. So I think there are two macro factors that an agent in the market can affect change in, maybe besides the US. One is policy, and two is societal norms. Because I think right now, the rules in which the private sector operates in, particularly in the US, does incentivize the best people to work in a for-profit environment, prioritizing profit maximization. In terms of the way that we look at the priorities of a publicly listed companies, your quarter this year needs to be a little bit higher than your quarter 12 months ago. And so there are all these rules and expectations in place in terms of how do you win in life as a person and as, an organization. It all steers towards, profit maximization. Now, what can we do to change that? Maybe I don't know if it'll be like NYSE, like the New York Stock Exchange, or one of the other, like a listed exchange, but to provide other metrics in which, like, we're talking about maximizing shareholder value beyond profit. But that means that we reverse engineer that. We need to know what is impact. Like, how do we, at a mass scale, across all million-plus nonprofits in the US alone, agree on the same metrics for impact? And I think there's a lot of pieces like that we need to create alignment for before we can actually get that moving.
And I want to stay on that because, Lucy, you talked about the language maybe holding us back. From where I'm standing, well, I was at the United Nations a few years ago, and there was an impact investment person here who said something in the lines of, well, you being grassroots women's rights organizations and advocates, you need to come to us and tell us, talking about impact matrices and all that, like, you need to come and basically share what you're doing, and we'll see if it fits into our new standards, right? And I feel that with an added technology aspect to it, especially if we're looking at philanthropy, that has been amplified times 10. And when you're on the other side, as a grassroots women's rights organization struggling to get funding, you are not equipped to deal with that. And so I was wondering if you guys could give us examples of ways in which that can be bridged. Have you experienced or seen, and I know in your work, Phil, maybe you're actively doing it, but how do we bridge? Because I feel the discussion about technology and philanthropy, there is this feeling that it's taking us further away from certain actors in our sector that I hope a lot of us agree are the actors who need to be strengthened and sustained.
I can go first then, I guess. I think one of the things we need to do is to make data across cultures and geography to be comparable. How do you actually standardize that? I think for quantitative data, it's manageable. You can manually finagle things and then make it work. But when we talk about qualitative data, example is, let's say 1 out of 7, how happy you are. You ask someone from New York and you ask someone from San Francisco. The median will be very different. The average New Yorker is like, I hate the world, I'm a 4. And then for San Francisco, that medium could be a 6. But they're both saying the same thing. That's the medium in terms of how people are feeling. Like, I won't get into the statistics behind it, but I guess the assumption I have is that most people, for most opinion on most things, is roughly like a standard bell curve. It's not meant to be anything too divisive or unique. So that's just one example. But I guess if you look at international aid, then we also have to look at the challenges of language, dialects, definitions. In some countries, there is no word for feminism. In many of the countries, if you want to talk about your mental wellness, or if you want to talk about recycling, the choice of words, a lot of that gets skewed. So like one thing that you can do is looking at a form of AI, we just call it language AI. There's 2 kinds, vision and language. So a lot of the stuff you saw earlier is vision AI. So if language is just about, can you like train a model that understands a dialect of a language, but to train that for like humanitarian purposes. And the way in which the large companies try to build these models is super expensive. Therefore, it's unlikely you're going to see a big company providing a model in Farsi of how people feel regarding fruits and vegetables. But they can probably tell you the difference between still water and sparkling water because that can benefit their e-commerce business. Yeah.
I'm not sure this is what you're getting at, but it may be what Phil's getting at. And this is what I meant by the language is holding us back. We're decades into a conversation now about the difficulty of measuring impact at scale. And yet, at the same time, the largest companies, the most successful companies in the world are providing personally customized experiences to billions of people on their phones. So how come they can do that and we can't have a conversation about impact at scale that starts with what 7 of us might know in a women-run giving circle in Nairobi that has a sister organization, whether or not they know each other, in Birmingham, Alabama, right? That are making change happen that is both motivating, fulfilling, and meaningful to those doing the giving, and meaningful and accelerating to those doing the work. Why aren't we having that conversation as opposed to how can a small group of incredibly concentrated talent take digitized data from the billions of people around the world who have generated it because without understanding the nature of what they're doing and what it's being used for, and decided that because for their business purposes, it's useful to address the question of still or sparkling water, but not for local produce, right? There's a point in that whole chain at which there's a power shift that which is required there in order to build artificially intelligent algorithms. You do need to draw from extraordinarily large data sources. Those data sources, by the way, every time I use the word data, replace it with the word person. And every time the conversation becomes about building an algorithm and analyzing that information, replace it with gatekeeper. Right? And I would agree with Phil that we're at a point in a trajectory of this, but we don't need to stay there. We don't need to keep it that way. We also need to have collective, informed conversations built from the power that we have about what those large sources of information should and should not be used for, and be able to engage in the trade-offs over whether it's about still or sparkling water or produce for my village. That is, as has been mentioned by every speaker I've heard so far, that data, that information is an abundant resource. Yet we are on completely unequal footing in terms of who is generating it, who it reflects, and who is making sense of it, and for what purposes. There's just a power schism there that has led to, and I use this word deliberately, that degree of power schism over other resources over time has led to, go ahead, say it, revolution. That's what we fought over. And that's what we are and should continue to be negotiating over now. And the most forward-thinking companies are, in fact, part of that conversation, are leading that conversation about that power dynamic.
Can I just add one thing in? If you look at a Stanford PhD computer science class, maybe you have like 10 graduates. And even of that level, I would say every year, maybe 1 or 2 would be really, really good. So right now, I think in my very specialized field of work, I think globally, there's about 30 of us working in this very specific area. And imagine you're working at a company and they know you're the superstar. They want you working on the most critical thing, to stay competitive with all of the other people doing very, very similar things. There will be more of a convergence, I would say, in terms of a lot of the AI services that you see coming from large companies. But it means that because they're so limited in supply of the best talents, it's hard to get that person to take away time to look at some of these other issues. And that's important because when we're looking at societal issues, in my opinion, it's actually harder than a lot of these commercial challenges that they're tackle. So you do need the best of the best, and maybe we can actually make a difference. So how do you consolidate that?
But that's going to fail.
Yeah.
It's going to fail.
Yeah.
If you got 30 people making decisions about products that affect the rest of the world, and the other 7 billion people have no say over that, it's going to fail, particularly when you're designing technologies that are, for the most part, then in the short term, commercially successful, is about convenience and efficiency, which means putting people out of work.
Yep.
Right?
I agree.
It may be short term outrageously expensive, and then midterm outrageously profitable, and long term it will fail.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But I think what's interesting, they agree.
We're supposed to be disagreeing, Phil.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. But I think what I hear you say, which is really interesting, is that there's a pipeline problem, first of all. Like, we're not, democratizing who's getting to be able to do that, and therefore what they're also choosing to do with it. And you say it's hard, but it's hard. It's also just lack of political will, and it's a hierarchy, obviously, of profit over social impact. But I'm interested also in looking at those structures of power that you mentioned, Lucy, and this obviously what we've just discussed, and going deeper into, we've learned a lot about what kind of giving works, right? We know that a one-time grant, it's not really going to help an organization sustain itself, right? Unless it's for a very specific type of work. So I get the feeling, having, obviously been on the side of those who need those resources to do the work, the important work, that the digital tools for philanthropy tend to also promote certain types of giving that we have learned with serious data and research are not the most effective ways of giving. So tell us a bit about that.
I guess I'll try to go up another way. I think with the advent of technology, we are kind of reshuffling the pieces on the board in terms of like how does the flow of capital go, and who are the people that are making decisions along that process. I do think it's ultra important for decisions to be made, or at least have input from people in the bottom capacity. And right now, that's not quite the case, because let's say you have 100,000 people that speaks Farsi providing input on what they think should be public education reform. How do you comprehend that? Do you hire 10,000 translators to translate that? Are you going to create a basic Google form and basically like robs of all the richness of the language? How do we actually synthesize these things? And this is not just in like foreign languages. It's the same like in like Swedish or in base language like English as well, where you see these reports about youth development, and you look at the sample size. Yeah, they surveyed like 500 people across the U.S. It's like, aha, this must be how all American youth feel regarding a certain thing. So I do think that technology can help with reorganizing where things are at. But I think it's still a little bit early stage, and I think the final piece that's really missing, it's more progressive, and I won't say tech literate, but at least donors that are comfortable with how technology can be a part of this flow. And I would say if we talk about gatekeepers, it's when you're trying to convince a master/PhD that specializes in philanthropy. For me, that's a historian. So convincing that person that there is a role of how technology can be incorporated, that is the hardest part.
Back to your original question, if I understand it correctly, can I rephrase it to see if, so is it about the way in which crowdfunding, apps that allow you to give, instant updates are motivating and facilitating quick one-off giving as opposed to a long sustained, is that what you're getting at?
As opposed to building a deeper collaborative philanthropic community that,
So there's a couple of things there. First of all, one of the things that we have to be clear about when we're looking at philanthropic activity writ large is that we're seeing a whole lot of behavior now because we can see digital transactions where it's hard to see cash transactions. So we're seeing a whole lot of behaviors that the behaviors are somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years old, but the vision into it is new, right? Because it's hard to see people on the other side of that wall helping each other, but because they leave a digital trail, we can see it now in the data, right? People have been helping people for a really, really long time, and we're seeing these small actions because they're being aggregated through technology platforms. So we think the behavior is new. But it's not, the behavior is not new, our visibility into it is new. So that's number one. What is important, and I don't know of anyone who is successfully, or any ones, that's not true, I do know, linking and bridging that kind of instant, quick, small action to sustained, larger, collective, aggregate action. What those pathways are now, I don't think those have been built digitally, so we don't see the digital equivalents of those. But I think it's a false assumption to assume that because I respond to an immediate ask for assistance on my smartphone and make a small gift one-off, I won't have either at that same moment in time, I won't also be a member of a more committed system, or I won't go to that. There's a marketing terminology for this that is proving to be unhelpful, and people are taking it on, which is, that ladder of engagement. The assumption that you start at the first step and you build. I think people are more complicated than that, and they do a lot of things at once, but we don't have the digital visibility into those other things. And it's an extraordinary opportunity for someone to take on. How do you actually help people see their own pathway? Because is it more important for everybody in this room to see their own agency and range of options, or is it more important for me sitting at my desk at Stanford to be able to see what you're all doing? Right? I would argue it's more important for you to be able to see what's open to you and what will be meaningful and fulfilling and where you can make change. Don't worry about me. I'll figure out. With Phil's help.
I thought you were going to say, I want to see what you
No, I don't. With Phil's help, I've got all the ways I need to possibly look at you. Right? I can see all kinds of things that I couldn't see before. And yes, if you're feeling a little creeped out, good. That's where I want you.
So before we open, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, but just, a quick kind of question just to get your insight into the future. The title is The New Frontiers of Digital Era Philanthropy. Just name them for us. Put words on them for us. What are these new frontiers?
You guys know Microsoft Excel?
Never heard of it.
Before Excel was introduced, accountants had to giant ledgers so when the first version of Excel was introduced, accountants were crying, standing in front of windows, because this can fundamentally change the way they do things. I think the way in which tools are being digitized for philanthropic purposes is not really changing behaviors. It's just making it online. It's still very similar to the way in which people have helped others. And I think that the next generation of tools I don't know if people cry over it, but I think we are on the cusp in the next couple of years of reaching a point where there are enough adoption of technology across business, government, the independent sector, that we can actually see end-to-end solutions that can be quite profound in terms of how flow of philanthropic capital could be. But a big piece missing from that, I think, is the community aspect, because all these things I mentioned are just institutions. And how do you actually reach out, to the marginalized and have them be included in that process? I don't have an answer for that, but that's very important.
Well, work on it, please.
So you want words to describe the frontier, and I am an historian. So two things. One, it's not new. We're in it. Digital is not coming. It came. It's not going away. It will be augmented, and it will shift to beyond digital. So the first thing I do, change the word new to old. But on the frontier side, there is a sense. There is a great urgency here, but I've been to too many conversations where the mindset is, how do we in civil society, we in philanthropy, use these tools? We can talk about that. That matters, but it is not the key question. So the words I'm going to switch for you here is, this is not an inside-out conversation, it's an outside-in conversation. And what I mean by that is, civil society fits in a certain space in our larger structures. And here I'm talking about democratic systems. In the democratic systems, you have a civil society, you have a government, you have a marketplace. Civil society, philanthropy are sort of everything that's not those other two, that's bigger than the family and not those other two. It's a very, very scientific definition. Those other two, the government, the public sector, and here I'm talking across cultures, and the private sector, they are deploying and using these tools to reshape the very issues that that third sector is working on. And if the third sector doesn't begin to recognize that that's also old, it's not new, it is continuing, and keeps chugging away the way it has been, it's going to be working on problems that have been fundamentally shifted right out from underneath its feet, and its solutions won't matter anymore. That's the bigger challenge. So the words I'm giving you are old, not new, outside in, not inside out, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Let's start with questions. We're going to get some mics. Okay, one in the back, and then we'll come to the front.
Okay, I'm Karen Stromquist from Social Venture Network. I wanted to get your perspective on impact and mass impact, because being in an art museum, it makes me reflect that there are a lot of pieces in here who were basically worthless when they were made a couple of 100 years ago, and now they're priceless and people are willing to pay millions of dollars for it. So are we putting ourselves in a trap by trying to measure things by sort of today's glasses? Impact right now, we talk about impact unicorns, we should reach 1 million people, but maybe it's enough to reach one person, but that person will, a couple of 100 years later, reach 1 million. I mean, how many saw Mona Lisa when she was painted? She's making impacts now, yeah. So that's a little reflection on that.
You're speaking the language of a historian, right? I'll tell you it matters 100 years. I'll tell you if it matters 100 years from now. I think talking about making a difference, making an impact matters. But I think, again, we've been very trapped in a conversation that is shaped by those things that can be quantified, financialized, commodified, and measured at at the use of this word scale, that if I could remove a word from all languages, that might be the one that I would remove. Not because scale doesn't matter, but because when we're having this conversation in the philanthropic and civil society sector, let us not forget that we are not solely responsible for scale. That's actually what governments and businesses are for. That's what they're good at. It's their job. And our scale may be very, very different. We have lost sight. We've adopted language that has narrowed our opportunities in a way that is actually belittling to what's special about us and distinguishes us from those other spaces in our society. And I think that's ultimately not to the benefit of anybody.
And I guess, just on the word impact and how that ties into philanthropy, I would say I feel like the main priority for philanthropy itself is much more about the disbursement of capital versus the outcome. I feel like when we talk about impact, we see that word in the compliance report, the M&E research, and in the storytelling. Not really in the work itself, because most of that we kind of delegate that to the nonprofit. It's like, well, with these rules and that outcome, you figure out a way to get there. So I would say that there needs to be more sharing, more partnerships between the two sides. And I think just having more dependable, accessible data that is reflective of the societal needs in a holistic way can get there. But I agree with you. I think that we should be outcome oriented and every lives matter. But right now, because we assume that resource is scarce in the philanthropic side, we try to leverage that. We want that $1 million to reach 1 million people, and if someone says it can reach 10 million people, let's give that a shot. And it is expensive to keep a person on their feet. And I think we need to be more humble with that. Yeah.
Other questions?
So you've both introduced this concept that I love, which is like radicalized democratization of digital. And that we need to be shapers and not just be shaped by, and there's a catching up to do. I wonder, I'm sure you're both aware that there's a movement under the umbrella, I'll call it compassionate capitalism, that a lot of organizations are pursuing. I'm just wondering to what degree either you're aware of it, collaborating with it, people who are leading Hunter Lovins and others who are trying to make some traction on that, because it seems a natural marriage, everything you're saying about us claiming back the power and the agency of the use of data, and what they're saying about claiming back what capitalism serves. So,
I'm aware of it. I'm not cooperating with it. I mean, I'm not collaborating with anybody who specifically identifies in that space. I think what's happening is there's a collective under a lot of names and coming from a lot of, having a lot of different sources of origin, people around the world are recognizing that the degree of inequity in the world right now needs addressing. And they're going to come at it from wherever they start. I think that's what's happening. That calls for reconsidering the nature and scope and reach of capitalism. I also, please don't put me down as having attempted to describe this as a radical democratization movement, because I would disagree with that. But people are also understanding the concentration of power in a variety of different domains. Now, that is very much the perspective of someone who lives in a former liberal democracy and whose ways of thinking about politics and power are shaped by the historical tradition of Western liberal democracies. I don't think that's the case in many parts of the world, and I do agree with Phil. He talked about the battle between the Chinese approach to AI and the US approach to AI. I think that's oversimplifying and overspecifying, but there are two very different, we are in a moment in time when there are, there's always been a battle between concentrated power and some more shared power, and it is playing itself out across economies and across the digital sphere, across societies, and affects everybody on the planet. So what you're seeing is a lot of responses to that.
I'm not too involved in that space, but I guess this reminds me of like the whole movement around like microfinance, like 10, 15 years ago, and I feel like compassion capitalism is almost like the current trendy word. But I think what's really missing is, if you look at the history of computer science, the first layer of code is just machine code. Just zeros and ones. It's very hard to work with. And then each generation of language that we build on top of that, called Python, C++, it's a derivative of this, and it's meant to make that very hard to work with language a little bit easier. We don't really have that for our space. It's very binary. We have nothing, or we have big companies providing a bridge, a light version of thing that works very well in business, but doesn't fit too well to our sector. So we need something a bit more incremental, and I think more relevant, to the needs that we have, and understanding and respecting the dynamics of how civil society works.
So we have time for maybe two more questions. So Ahmed, and maybe Mercy. We'll see.
Thank you, and great panel. My God. My question to you guys is that in terms of not maybe the new, but the frontier, technology is inherently not good or bad, but it tends to also how do you say, enhance our prejudice in many ways. Just spreads it more. It can also spread the good also more. But there's a group that we have forgotten in terms of the philanthropy in many ways. For example, now we have a lot of diaspora coming to these countries. That I'm one of them in Sweden, and that's a group that we don't really see in these talks and in our mind when we're thinking about this conversation. But they contribute more in terms of money times, and more sustainable. in my country and other countries than perhaps what philanthropy from here does most of the time. So are we missing that group, and how can we make that group in terms of digital, in terms of seeing them as a philanthropist and not only as, how do you say, people who just giving back to their mothers or fathers, so that's my question to you. How do we recognize that group, and how do we bring them into the conversation, and how do we give them the tools to be an agent, and not just talk about the people who they left behind home to help. And in terms of digital, for example, in Sweden there's a new company called Transfer Galaxy that has made it much easier, especially for Somalis at least, to send money home through SMS and all that. So there's a lot of companies like this we are missing right now. So I want to hear your ideas on touching them.
I'm actually writing a book called How We Give Now, and it takes on this question directly. Written from the perspective of the US, in which there's a certain kind of activity, a subsector of all the ways humans give that has been privileged and studied to death. And it looks like old white people with a lot of money, building buildings. And it has really very little to do with how we give now. So it's about shifting the conversation. In terms of how you get those people you invite them. You recognize they exist and you invite them and you reshape the conversation. I don't think it's the people who've been excluded who need to change, it's the people who've been setting these tables who need to recognize that they're talking to a very small slice of the whole. Now, I'm writing this book now at this point in time for political reasons in the US. Because the more we, again, and it goes down to the way language limits what we think matters. We're having debates in my country about tax privileges on a single behavior that benefits a tiny slice of people that we call philanthropy. We're not having conversations about things like broadband access and net neutrality and the transfer fees associated with money transfers that benefit an enormous slice of people that are actually philanthropic in nature. So we've captured a political conversation without even really knowing, and I don't mean we here, but a political conversation has been captured and is shaping policies that is deliberately leaving people out. So if we can expand what we understand to be the way people help each other, again, those behaviors are not new. They're being facilitated and made more visible by technology, and we have to consider both the good and the bad of that, and then shape our public policy to facilitate that, which to my mind, in a democracy, the most people, not the ones who can actually shape the conversation.
I'll just keep it brief. Maybe, I think this is more of a reframing issue, because, and maybe there's something to keep in mind for next year's SPF, is invite the Minister of Interior, of Employment, because this is where we're talking about social inclusion, we're talking about security, and this is right on the top of the agenda. But the lens is that it's not coming from a philanthropic angle. But I think there's also legal challenges there. Like I work in the Middle East, primarily right now, and I am following the Arab diaspora, 1 million plus in Germany, 300,000 here. And a big challenge is that the role in which a refugee is defined, until they become recognized as a migrant, if they're a refugee, it's hard for a private philanthropic organization to be directly involved in the humanitarian issue. They have to go through UNHCR. And if you're not too fond of the UN system, you rather keep away. Or you're like Bill Gates, and you're basically a small country, and you're like, well, we're just gonna do things our way, and you either take it or leave it. So we need to so I see that more on the policy side, but I think in terms of domestically here in Sweden, just approach it from a different lens.
So I'm sorry, we do not have any more time, but the good news is it's our networking break, so these guys will be available for questions and further conversations. I think Roger had a crazy idea that we've decided to take on. So Phil, after the networking break, is actually going to do his lightning talk in the sculpture garden, because we have this beautiful room. Yes, thank you. Very brave of you to do that.
AI with sculptures.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when we finish the networking break in 30 minutes, please go through the sculpture garden and actually stay there. And Phil will do his chat, and we'll come back here for Lucy's keynote. So as you'll see in the program, we've just switched those two items. Thank you very much, and enjoy the break.
High five. That was good.